Hey everybody, this is Dr. Michael Schultz back again with the Baptist Directory, and today for our first episode we are looking at Dr. Robert Greene Lee, or better known as R.G. Lee. He was born the 11th of November 1886 and died on the 20th of July 1978. R.G. Lee is one of those preachers that you probably haven't heard of, but that you really should have. His legacy really extended far beyond him, and his reputation was so highly regarded in his time. It's a very odd thing that our generation and future generations have little regard for the man who meant so much to his own generation. We know names such as W.A. Criswell and George Truett, the pastors of First Baptist Dallas, for a long time the largest and most prosperous Southern Baptist Church, if not the largest church in the United States for a very long time, spent almost 100 years under two pastors there. But W.A. Criswell himself had this to say about R.G. Lee. He said, "One time in each century, and once in a while in each generation, God raises up a true prophet, a prince of preachers. In this century and in this generation, that favored evangel is the world-famous pastor of Bellevue Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee. To uncounted thousands and thousands of young ministers, he is a veritable paragon of excellence in the preparation and delivery of sermons. His voice, his manner, his striking illustrations, and the spiritual depth and content of his message work together to create an indelible impression upon the hearts and souls of all of us who love to hear him, and who are enthralled by the glorious heights to which he raises his audience toward God. R.G. Lee is the most gifted and eloquent preacher of our time." Now that's high praise coming from W.A. Criswell, and it's well deserved. Dr. Lee was so highly regarded in his day, mostly because of his ability to be a leader and a pastor, but his credibility doesn't stop there. To give you just a couple of his accolades, he achieved a Bachelor of Arts in 1913 from Furman University in South Carolina, and went on to achieve a Ph.D. in international law from the Chicago Law School in 1920. But that's not the end of his educational accolades. He went on to subsequently be awarded 11 honorary doctorate degrees. Count that again, that's 11 doctorate degrees that were awarded to him on an honorary basis because of his high academic credibility and his impact on the world around him. He was thrice elected president of the Southern Baptist Convention, being elected in 1948, 1949, and 1950, and he was 4 times elected president of the Tennessee Baptist Convention in 1932, 33, 34, and 35. So let's learn a little bit about the man, Dr. R.G. Lee. He was born in the pre-dawn hours of the 11th of November, 1886, in a 3-room cabin in York County, South Carolina. His father was David Ayers Lee, a sharecropping farmer, and his mother was Elizabeth Bennett Lee, a homemaker. As the 5th child of what would ultimately be 6 brothers and 2 sisters, it's interesting to note that upon his birth, a midwife is said to have danced around the room and proclaimed that God had sent a preacher to this house. Now, how she knew that is never really explained, but that's the claim, was that when he was born, the midwife that delivered him proclaimed that God had sent a preacher to that house. His upbringing didn't indicate anything of the sort. He worked on the farm as the family raised cotton and corn, wheat, and watermelons, trying to eke out a living. They tilled and worked the soil right alongside former slaves who lived in their district. Remember, this is the late 1800s, 30, 40 years following the end of the Civil War and the liberation of African Americans in America. They were very, very poor in this era. The family's annual income, even with their children, 6 brothers, 2 sisters, and plus Dr. Lee, so you had 9 children in the household. Even with all of the children working and dad, you still would see an annual income of sometimes $300 per year. They attended church every Sunday. Each Sunday evening, they'd have service at their own home. The children would be expected to read the scriptures aloud for mom and dad. And at church one week, when Dr. Lee was 12 years old, he heard a message on heaven. And they went back to the evening service this particular Sunday, and there was another message on Christ. And Dr. Lee says that he recalled that when he went home that night, he had the most wretched feeling. This is his exact quote. He says, "I could not sleep. I got up in the night and slipped out the window that opened on the back porch and went down to the moonlit watermelon patch. It was a beautiful, clear night, and I thought about heaven beyond the stars, and I thought about hell somewhere in the vast region below. I had to plow the next day, but my misery only grew until I finally drove out to the end of a long row and dropped the plow down by the side of Barney, my old white mule. I got down in the fence corner and told God that I felt awfully bad, awfully sinful, and that I wanted to be saved. And if one must accept Jesus to be saved, I prayed, then I accept him. And right there in that fence corner, the Lord saved me. That's his quote of his salvation story. And soon after, on August the 5th of 1898, he was baptized at his church, which is the First Baptist Church of Fort Mills. He felt immediately thereafter that he was called to preach, but he couldn't get any education. There really wasn't much opportunity for him there. And he had already promised his father that he would stay and work on the farm until he was 21 to help pay the family bills. And he did that. He kept his promise to his father, working on the farm until he was 21. And in that time, he received essentially no formal education outside of what was offered at home and what he could procure for himself. Now, it was the case that shortly after his conversion, he sought out formal education for himself because he did want to be a preacher. And so he began making a 3-mile walk ever so often to see a man that he identifies as Professor Boyd. And this individual, Professor Boyd, whoever he was, began teaching him Latin in exchange for his work trapping rabbits and doing other manual labor. Sometimes he would pay Professor Boyd. He sold peanuts on his own time. And at 16 years old, at some point in his interactions with Professor Boyd, Dr. Lee met an individual named Dr. Edwin Poteet, who was at that point the president of Furman University. And Dr. Poteet told him about a school that they were starting called the Furman Fitting School. So, time goes on, and Dr. Lee, at 21 years old, finishes his commitment to his father, and he borrows $250 from the local bank to go and work on the Panama Canal, which they were constructing at that time. Now, this trip did not go how he intended it to go. He was actually postponed because his train arrived late in New Orleans, which caused him to miss his departing ship that was meant to take him to Panama. And that left him in New Orleans with $1 to survive on for 7 days until the next ship arrived to take him to Panama. And so he, of course, has to find some sort of work to make a little bit of money to live on. And he started working at the local docks to make a little bit of money. When he finally did make it to Panama, the situation wasn't much better because the job that he had gone down to take was no longer available. And so he had to arrange for a new job. He finally does get a job, and he works for about 10 months, just less than a year, and he begins making preparation to make the trip back to the United States because he has enough money to achieve all that he wanted to get. When he starts making his trip back, he contracts some terrible sort of illness that was common in Panama, but not really understood by the medicine of the time. The way that they traditionally treated this illness in Panama was they laid the person on an ice slab, and they just left you there. And I guess they thought the cold of the ice slab would have some sort of a positive effect. They applied this treatment to Dr. Lee, and during the quote-unquote treatment, he passed out. Just completely expired. He woke up later, happy to be alive, and even happier to get out of Panama. So he gets back to the United States, and he spends most of what he had made actually paying off the remaining family debts that his father still had, and he used the rest that he had left to begin his formal education. Upon his return from Panama in 1909, he began doing preparatory work at that institution that Dr. Poteet had told him about, the Fuller Fitting School. And that was more or less a bridge institution that was meant to get individuals that had some formal education, maybe an elementary or middle school education, into the college level. And so he studied algebra and English, geometry, Greek, and Latin at the Furman Fitting School, and then in 1909 enrolled at Furman University. Now, he worked a lot of jobs while he was going through college. He did not have enough money to fully pay for it, but he did work several jobs while going through school, most of them pastoral jobs. He served as the youth pastor at the First Baptist Church of Lima, South Carolina. That was his first church job. In April of either 1909 or 1910, the records vary on the specific year, but on April the 3rd of either 1909 or 1910, he returned to First Baptist of Fort Mills, which was his home church, and he was ordained there into the ministry. While he's going through college, he's pastoring churches, trying to make ends meet, sometimes as many as 3 churches at a time. But in the meantime, he's attending at Furman, and he was at church one day at a revival at Riverside Baptist Church in Greenville, South Carolina, and he hears this voice, and there's this girl that is singing this song, Whispering Hope. It was the most beautiful thing that he had ever heard, and he knew he must talk to this young lady. And so after the service, he goes and talks to her. Her name was Beulah Gentry, and he absolutely fell in love with her. And so they began courting, and very soon after, he ended up asking her to marry him. Now, she was aware that he was called into the ministry. And so when he asked her to marry him, she responded, and she said, quote, "I don't know that I can be a preacher's wife. I can't speak in public." Now, bear in mind, this is during the era in which preachers' wives, specifically in the Baptist tradition, are expected to be more or less the leader of all women's ministries in churches. That was very standard. That was an expectation. They were expected to be able to sing, be able to lead the WMU ministry, be able to lead the young women's ministries. And so she was aware of that kind of expectation and pressure. But he responded very calmly, and he said, quote, "Who asked you to speak in public? I can do that. I'm asking you to be my wife." And so Dr. Lee was thoroughly aware of the expectations and the nervousness that she had, and maybe even the rightful nervousness that she had, because she was truthfully understanding the circumstances into which she was coming as a pastor's wife. But he also understood his responsibility to protect his wife and to take care of her, to make sure that she didn't have any unnecessary expectations placed on her. And this is something that modern pastors need to be aware of, that we are called into the ministry. Your wife was not. And Dr. Lee is a forerunner in understanding that. He knew that he was called into the ministry and his wife was not, but he wanted to marry her because of who she was. That's so important for ministers to get today. And when they got engaged, Dr. Lee was so poor, he couldn't even afford a ring. Okay, so he just more or less agreed to be married to her, and she accepted that agreement on word of faith. He graduates with honors in 1913 from Furman, and they get married that same year. Their anniversary was the 26th of November, 1913. They were really, really poor at this time. Even though he was working, pastoring as many as 3 churches at a time, just in the 4 years that he attended Furman University, he pastored 12 different churches. And that's not to say that his tenures were all that small or short. It's just that he was simultaneously pastoring multiple churches. That wasn't all that uncommon in those days. People would only attend church once a month a lot of the time. And so a pastor would set up a circuit, and he would pastor each church individually. He would be at First Baptist of such and such town on the first Sunday of the month, and at such and such Baptist church on the second Sunday of the month, and this Baptist church on the third Sunday, and then he would repeat the cycle. Well, he's doing that, but he's still very poor because these churches are quite humble. And one of the churches that he was pastoring in this era was Harmony Baptist Church. And it's interesting, it's a super cool detail today that at one point, the church there donated the communion set that Dr. Lee had used while he was their pastor, and it's still on display at a museum that displays his effects today. Now, despite all this work, pastoring 3 churches at a time, 12 in 4 years, he is still so poor that he had to borrow $1,800 from one of his professors at Furman in order to build a home for himself and his wife. I mean, this was a really difficult time for him, and bear in mind, this is still prior to the Great Depression. We're not even to that era yet. He was so taxed by this emotionally that he records in some of his records that he was going several days without sleep because of anxiety and stress over how he was going to financially provide for his family. And this was only more intensified on the 2nd of January 1917 when they welcomed a daughter into the world, Miss Beulah Gentry Lee, who later became Miss Beulah Gentry King, named after her mother. This was a very taxing time, not just because he was having a hard time raising money, but because his daughter was very sickly as a child, and so medical costs began to pile up. And this was beginning to reach his wit's end. He did not know how he was going to survive this, pastoring multiple churches at a time, trying to make ends meet. And then one day, President Poteet at Furman approached him and asked him if he would consider becoming the chair of the Latin department at Furman. And this was like an answered prayer for Dr. Lee. He was so excited to receive this offer. He immediately resigned some of the pastorates that he was serving at that point to open up his schedule. He did intend to continue preaching at some point, to continue pastoring, but he resigned those churches and began to commit fully to being a professor. In fact, that summer, he took courses at Tulane University in New Orleans to extend his Latin proficiency and expertise. But while he was away in New Orleans taking those classes at Tulane, the trustees at Furman University passed a resolution that forbade professors from pastoring simultaneously with their professorate. He didn't know that happened. And so he returns from Tulane, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready to enter the professorate, only to find that he cannot pastor and professor at the same time. And this was just a gut punch to him. He was $4,000 in debt. He's looking at a wife. He's looking at a child who's rather sick and has compounding medical bills. And he has to decide, are you going to be a pastor or a professor? Well, his wife didn't hesitate a bit. As she said to him, this is the quote, "The Lord never intended for you to dig around in Latin roots. He called you to be a preacher." Would to God that we had wives like that. Amen. So Dr. Lee, with the support of his wife, he resigns from Furman University and he commits himself to being a pastor. It's not long until Dr. Lee is called in 1918 to be the pastor of First Baptist Church of Edgefield, South Carolina. Now, he's very young and rather unorthodox at this point, and so when he learned that the church was $10,000 in debt, his experience with debt really impacted his response to that. He was so nervous about the church being in debt that he announced one Sunday, this is the quote, "Next Sunday morning we will pay off our church debt. All gifts must be dough on the barrel. Nobody must give over $500. What he gives more will be returned, but we want everyone to have a part." Now, that that sounds like something that a brand new young pastor would do. And so you can see here that even the distinguished Dr. Lee was at one point young and a bit, wet behind the ears. But despite harsh criticism that came in the backlash after this, the next week the church did in fact receive $14,000 in offerings, which they used to pay off the $10,000 in debt and the remaining $4,000 to build him and his wife a new home. And so it worked. For one way or another, it worked. It was also at First Baptist Edgefield that he first offered a devotion in 1919 to his deacons that he entitled "Payday Someday." It was a very short devotion at the time, but at the end of it, one of his deacons approached him and said, "Now, you've really got something there, my boy. Why don't you make a full-length sermon out of it? I think it's wonderful." And so Dr. Lee took that to heart, I think, as most pastors would. If your deacons or even anybody in your church came up to you and said, "Oh, you've really got something there, you should make that a sermon," I think we would respond as Dr. Lee did. He says that he stayed up until 2 o'clock in the morning expanding and reworking that devotion into a full-length sermon. And it will come up later on, "Payday Someday." While he was serving at Edgefield, he completed his PhD in international law from Chicago's law school through correspondence courses, and he would continue serving there at First Baptist Edgefield for 3 years before he left to go to First Baptist Church of Chester, South Carolina. Now, he would stay at the First Baptist Church of Chester for only 16 months, but in the time that he was there, he saw 415 additions to the church, 300 of them by conversion and baptism. Now, upon leaving, after the 16-month stint he spent there, he went to the First Baptist Church of New Orleans and became involved in the advancement of the Southern Baptist Convention while he was there. In that period, the Southern Baptist Convention was forwarding something called the 75 Million Campaign. This was a initiative that the Southern Baptist Convention put into place that's somewhat of a forerunner for the cooperative program. In fact, I think that it would be fair to say that it was the forerunner of the cooperative program. It was a 5-year initiative that proposed to raise $75 million for the Southern Baptist Convention. This is as a result of certain denominations after the First World War realized through the government's use of war bonds that people at this time had quite a bit of expendable income that they were ready to give to noble and worthy causes. And so churches like the Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church capitalized on this. The Southern Baptist Convention was actually a bit late to the party, but the 75 million campaign was greatly successful. They did not succeed in raising the full $75 million. They actually received commitments for over $90 million, but I believe they raised something just short or in the field of about $60 million, which was much less than they had prescribed. It was a lot more than they would have gotten without the campaign, but the problem was the institutions and entities of the Southern Baptist Convention were operating, and they had moved their budgets to accommodate a $75 million income, and so they ended up in debt at the end of the initiative, despite it being a great increase in income, nevertheless. But Dr. Lee was a big part of the 75 million campaign there in New Orleans. He was also a big contributor to the Baptist Bible Institute of New Orleans, which would go on to become what we now call the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. And so his impact on the Southern Baptist Convention began rather early. He's only been in the pastorate for a few years, and here he's already making an impact through the 75 million campaign and contributions in the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, what was then the Baptist Bible Institute of New Orleans. He'd spent 3.5 years as the pastor there at First Baptist Church of New Orleans, and in the 3.5 years that he was there, he added 1,016 new members, with 300 of them being by profession of faith and baptism. And so even though his tenures were rather short, they were so successful. He would leave the First Baptist Church of New Orleans to go back to South Carolina and pastor the Citadel Baptist Church in South Carolina. At that point, it was the largest Baptist church in the state. Very, very prestigious position. But there again, his tenure at that church, First Baptist Citadel, only lasted 2 years. He was there exactly 100 Sundays. And so in these transitional years, he's noted as pastoring a few churches. We didn't mention, but during his last year before he went to First Baptist of Edgefield, he's noted as pastoring Red Bank Church in Saluda, South Carolina in 1917. 1918 to 1920, pastoring First Baptist Church of Edgefield, South Carolina. 1920 to 2022, pastoring First Baptist Church of Chester, South Carolina. 1922 to 1925, pastoring First Baptist Church of New Orleans. And 1925 to 27, pastoring the Citadel Baptist Church, or Citadel Square Church in Charleston, South Carolina, before receiving a call to come to a church in Memphis, Tennessee that was called Bellevue Baptist Church. And this is really the church where Dr. Lee will make a name for himself. It's where he will be known for the next 33 years, and it's where he'll really establish himself as a Southern Baptist leader. When Dr. Lee arrived at Bellevue, the church was what could comparatively be called a ramshackle little shack. It was a reputable church for its era and in its place, but compared to what it would become under his leadership, it was a ramshackle little hut. In 1927, when he was called to Bellevue, bear in mind, his average tenure up to that point at churches was only 2 years. He did not have what we would today call a reputable tenure track. He had never stayed at a church longer than 3 or 4 years. And so arriving at Bellevue, I don't really know what they would have expected out of him, other than massive growth over a very short period of time, which he had seen everywhere that he went. But he would stay at Bellevue in Memphis for 33 years, and during his pastorate there, he was wildly busy. For all 33 years, wildly busy. He wrote in his diary at one point, this is a given day, quote, "Up at 6 a.m., prayer, study, evangelistic service for junior department, had 11 to confess faith in Christ, preached on God of Jacob, our refuge. Service broadcast, baptized 2 after morning service, preached at night, 33 editions, baptized 10 at evening service. Very tired when went to bed, grieved over the news of Lieutenant Perkins's being killed, first in our church membership to die." This is a given day for him as a new pastor at Bellevue Baptist Church. You can imagine what this would have been like for him and for his family. But under his leadership, Bellevue became the leading Baptist congregation in the state of Tennessee. And under his leadership, it completed a magnificent remodel and construction process. In 1930, they moved into what's called a magnificent building and saw its membership grow to 4,800 members in 1938. So very quickly, he's been there 11 years, and the church that was at one point in this ramshackle little hut is now a church of nearly 5,000 members. The church since then has produced 3 Southern Baptist presidents. Dr. Lee was the president of the SBC from 1948 to 1951. His successor, Ramsey Pollard, was the president of the SBC from 1959 to 1961. And Adrian Rogers was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention from 1979 to 1980, and again from 1986 to 1988. Of course, you know Adrian Rogers, one of the leading figures of the conservative resurgence or the fundamentalist takeover, depending on your view of what happened through the 1980s and into the 1990s in the Southern Baptist Convention. Bellevue became a dominating force in the Southern Baptist and particularly the Tennessee Baptist Convention. Membership went from 1,739 to 9,469, and through the course of his pastorate there, Dr. Lee saw 24,071 additions and 7,649 baptisms. I'll say that again. 24,071 additions to the church. 7,649 by baptism. While he was at Bellevue, he was so highly regarded that he was offered the pastorate at Calvary Baptist Church in New York City. He was offered the presidency of the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, and twice he was offered the presidency of Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. So, what made Dr. Lee so appealing? What made him so magnanimous that people seem to have flocked to him wherever he went? Well, let's look at a couple of his distinctives. First of all, his preaching style. He was a product of his time. He considered the invitation to be the most important part of the service. At one point he explained, he says it this way, quote, "If I were your dinner guest and I left before the meal was over without asking to be excused, you would think I was discourteous, and I would be. But that's what I think of people who leave out just as the invitation is being given for people to accept Christ. If I walked into the operating room and slapped the arm of the surgeon who was operating on your loved one to save him from physical death, you would think I was cruel. So do I think that those who attend our services and hinder the effort to enlist Christians in service, to urge those who are lost to accept the Savior by leaving as the invitation hymn begins." He took this deadly serious. One man who's well known in the Southern Baptist Convention, Duke McCall, he was pastoring at Centertown Baptist Church in 1939, and he didn't really know how to preach yet, and he knew that Dr. Lee was a magnanimous figure in the Southern Baptist Convention, and so he took the opportunity at one point to drive Dr. Lee to a preaching engagement in Lexington, Kentucky. And he talked to him for several hours during the drive, and he heard him preach while he was there and drove him back. And upon his return to Centertown, Dr. McCall wrote a sermon in which he says, this is from his oral history, he says, "I imitated Dr. Lee's preaching style. It was kind of a case of putting on Saul's armor. I got in the middle of the sermon and got tickled at myself trying to use Lee's alliterative description, and then the congregation started laughing, and they knew I was in over my head, and so we all went into hysterics right there in the church. I told them what I was doing and who I was trying to imitate, and I closed the sermon quickly and we left. Now, this was something that was probably not unique to Dr. McCall. I'm sure, as is the case today, many people were imitating his preaching style and trying to emulate his sort of success. It was his practice to use repetition. He continually used alliteration all through his sermons. If you read his sermons, you'll see he uses the same phraseology over and over, uses the same letters to begin certain words to make it memorable, to make it stick with his audience. And he even would use very illustrative and depictive words. He took liberty with the text in such ways as in his famous sermon, Payday Someday, he has a description of King Ahab that is quite unparalleled. It's unforgettable. He says, "King Ahab, that vile human toad who squatted upon the throne of his nation, the worst of Israel's kings." And he preached this way. You can imagine that image of King Ahab, the vile human toad who squatted upon the throne. It's as if he knew him. It's as if he had seen him, you know? And he would make that sort of illustration, that depiction in his sermons that just made the sermon come to life right in front of you. He often preached from manuscripts. He would memorize his manuscript before he went up to preach. And he also made a regular habit of repeating sermons. Dr. McCall says that at one point when he was the president of the SBC and Dr. McCall was the executive secretary, he traveled with him quite a bit. And he says, I could have almost delivered some of his speeches that he made. He would work hard on a speech, and then he would use it whenever he needed it. One point, he says he thinks it, this is Dr. Lee, he thought it better for a person to hear a good sermon twice than to hear a bad sermon once. That was his mentality. He did have somewhat of a relationship with Dr. McCall. Of course, his work as the executive secretary and Dr. Lee's work as the president thrice over. But also they had a personal relationship. Dr. McCall met Dr. Lee when he volunteered to work as a youth worker at Bellevue's summer program. And Dr. McCall described Dr. Lee. He said there was such a charismatic quality about him that he carried his church along with him. Whatever he recommended or wanted was always done. He did not depend on preaching to get the job done. He depended on the Sunday school. He depended on the training union organizations as the way to involve church members in the outreach and Bible study and membership training programs of the church. Dr. McCall goes on, he says, this intrigued me at the time, how good he was at organization. He was really good at delegation. He knew how to tell somebody what he wanted and then leave that person alone to get it done. I found him a very pleasant guy to be around, and I enjoyed our relationship. So he seems to be a very likable person. He was not a micromanager. He seems to be a person that was very good at organization and delegation, as Dr. McCall would explain. He was very good at using his sermons to reach the average person by using average language, the colloquial language of his day. He used repetition to drive thoughts home, and sometimes even repeated sermons to get the point of those sermons home. But he was not undoctrinal. That's one of the things that's a criticism of people of this generation, was that they were so down to earth, so desiring to reach the average person that they actually bereaved themselves of doctrinal depth. That is the case for some people that we'll talk about later on in future episodes, but that wasn't the case for Dr. Lee. He was very well known for his doctrinal distinctives. He was conservative to the point of at times even being labeled as a fundamentalist. He despised ecumenicism. He opposed it vehemently as it tried to creep into Southern Baptist circles. Ecumenicism was bringing in a lot of what he called, or what they would term as, liberal theology during the day. He wasn't afraid to partner and cooperate with other evangelicals across America, but he was very much against the idea of ecumenicism, especially during his presidency during the 1940s and into the early 50s. Dr. McCall knew Lee as a man that he said was willing to argue for a more conservative theological posture in Southern Baptist agencies, seminaries, colleges, and so on. But he said that he would do it without trying to change the political power structure of the convention. Now, of course, Dr. McCall there is referencing the Southern Baptist strife that happened in the 1980s and into the 90s, as we previously mentioned. But he does note that Dr. Lee was a thoroughly conservative theological man. And we know that because of a couple of different things. First of all, in the 1930s, he's noted as a major prohibitionist. Most Baptists were in this era. You got to keep in mind the constitutional amendment in the United States prohibiting the sale and transportation of alcohol across any state lines or national borders. The amendment there, we were in the Prohibition era for a long time. We had just repealed Prohibition. And so there was still a large number of Baptists in this era that were leading Prohibitionist movements. He was a part of what was called the Anti-Saloon League in the 1937-38 year, and they succeeded in getting Tennesseans to vote not to repeal Prohibition on their statewide basis. And even after that, they succeeded in getting Tennessee to pass laws that would allow individual counties to determine whether they were going to be what they call wet counties, moist counties, or dry counties. That is, having full ability to sell alcohol without any restrictions, having some sales of alcohol with some restrictions, or having no sale of alcohol at all. At the height of the fundamentalist modernist debate or crisis, that's the 1920s and 30s, Dr. Lee was right there contending in the midst of that. He wrote an article for the Baptist and Reflector. That was the Tennessee Baptist paper at the time. I believe it's still in print. He wrote an article for them entitled, "What is Divine Inspiration?" That was in the 1930s. He defended what we now call the verbal plenary inspiration of Scripture. He called the Bible, quote, an infallible book that would never pass away. In 1930, in the midst of that debate, the modernist fundamentalist debate, he preached a message entitled "The Word of God Not Broken and Not Bound." And it was important that he wrote this, he preached this, because he said in that sermon, quote, "All who wrote are immortalized by their writing in this great book, supernatural in origin, divine in authorship, human in penmanship, infallible in authority, infinite in scope, universal in interest, personal in application, regenerative in power, inspired in totality." He was so firmly on one side of that debate that in 1935 he actually ran for president of the Southern Baptist Convention, but he was beat by Dr. John R. Sampe because of his fundamentalist ties. People considered him at that time a bit too right-wing. But of course, we know later on the term fundamentalist would move, and you'll actually see that in a moment when we talk about some of the conflicts that he had and his major impact on the Southern Baptist Convention. Where did he get his ideas, his preaching style? Well, growing up, he studied the homiletical style of T. DeWitt Talmage. He was a nationally known pastor out of the Brooklyn Tabernacle. He wasn't a Baptist individual, but he did study his homiletical styles. He also studied the narrative style of Sam Jones, who was a Methodist pastor at that time. Of course, he passed away early in Dr. Lee's life, but these were the individuals that he studied, T. DeWitt Talmage, Sam Jones. Notice he doesn't attribute his style or his study habits to any Baptist. He attributes it entirely to people who were not Baptist. And that kind of shows you that at this point, Baptists were beginning to have to look elsewhere for their understanding of how to preach and what to preach, because there was something going on in the Baptist denomination and the Baptist group that was losing some of its denominational distinctives. Now, I mentioned that Dr. Lee had a major impact on the Southern Baptist Convention, and that began all the way back in the 19-teens and early 20s when he was a part of the 75 Million campaign and his influence there at the Bible Institute of New Orleans. But when he was the president of the SBC, he made a pretty major impact on the convention, specifically in 1949. In 1949, the Southern Baptist Convention met for its annual meeting in Oklahoma City, and at that point, an amendment was put forward at the convention that's come to be known now as the Aldridge Amendment. It was put forward by a guy named Eugene Perry Aldridge. He more commonly known as E.P. Aldridge, and he was putting forward an amendment that was attacking the Foreign Mission Board at that time, now the International Mission Board, because some of the trustees of the IMB or the FMB at that time were associated with an ecumenical association of churches that Dr. Aldridge considered too liberal, too ecumenical. And although Dr. Lee was not in any way sympathetic to ecumenical, liberal institutions or associations, he acted in the defense of the Foreign Mission Board in this instance because it was the best thing for the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, to give you a little more background on this, E.P. Aldrich was putting forward an amendment that sought to ban anyone from having anything to do with Southern Baptist entities if they were in any way associated with ecumenical associations such as the National Council of Churches. The exact amendment, Dr. Aldrich writes in his book, While Southern Baptists Sleep, the amendment read as follows. It said, and quote, "No one who belongs to or is affiliated with any state or local council of churches which is connected with or sponsored by the Inter-Council Field Department of the Federal Council or any one or more of its 6 affiliated councils shall be eligible to serve on any board, agency, or institution of this convention, whether as an official, employee, or board member." Now, Dr. Aldrich, who made this proposal, he was writing for J. Frank Norris's publication, The Fundamentalist, under a pseudonym. That was only discovered later. He attacked liberalism in the SBC and the Sunday School Board, even though he was working for the Sunday School Board at the time. That's why he had to write anonymously for The Fundamentalist, so as to not be discovered. Of course, he actually was discovered by Duke McCall. And there was a man who was the director of the Foreign Mission Board at the time named Theron Rankin. He was good friends with Duke McCall, who at that point was the executive secretary of the SBC. And Theron Rankin became aware through the grapevine that Dr. Aldrich was privately working with J. Frank Norris and subverting Southern Baptist causes and really critiquing and attacking the Southern Baptist Convention altogether. And Theron Rankin goes up on stage at the 1949 Southern Baptist Convention's annual meeting in OKC, and he asked Duke McCall, "Do you have information confirming that Dr. Aldrich is in communication and working for J. Frank Norris?" Dr. McCall said that he did. He said, "Can you produce this information?" He said, "I can." And he said, "I want you to produce it, and I'm going to present it here." Now, Dr. McCall said, "If you do that, it'll be the end of you. Because anyone who throws mud, you get mud on your own hands as well as the other person too, right?" But Dr. Rankin was convinced this was the best thing for the convention. And so Dr. McCall opens his desk right there on the stage of the Southern Baptist Convention and pulls out these documents that prove that Dr. Aldrich was writing for J. Frank Norris. They were carbon copies of articles that he had written, and Dr. McCall had somehow come upon them prior to their publication. So he steps up and he's going to put this in front of the convention and show everyone that Dr. Aldrich, who's put forward this amendment, is actually just trying to tear apart the SBC. And before he and Dr. McCall can throw this all out there, before the proverbial can hit the fan, R.G. Lee steps up and he refuses to allow Dr. Rankin to have the mic. And instead, Dr. Lee makes a speech on the stage of the Southern Baptist Convention's annual meeting on behalf of the unity of the Southern Baptist Convention and the integrity of the Foreign Mission Board. And his support was so influential that the vote for the Aldrich motion immediately failed. And Dr. McCall later on commented and he said, "My feeling is that Dr. Lee protected Rankin and the Foreign Mission Board in that heated situation." McCall goes on, "I think Lee knew exactly what he was doing." So he even was willing to make sacrifices on his own convictions, his vehement opposition of ecumenical movements for the good of the Southern Baptist Convention and the preservation of the good reputation of the Foreign Mission Board. Dr. McCall said that Lee's goal was to elicit, combine, and direct the energies of the Baptist denomination of Christians for a more effective propagation of the gospel to the lost. He saw what was happening as division and loss of strength, and therefore he swung his full weight as president into the breach. Years later, the Christian Index, which is the Baptist paper of the Georgia Baptist Convention, it's the largest, or not the largest, for a while it was very large. It's the longest serving Baptist paper in the United States. They wrote of Dr. Lee, "He provided strong leadership for the convention he loved, and there were times when the convention took a different course merely upon the advice of its president." And of course, they didn't note it there, but it's in complete reference to the Aldrich Amendment that statement is made. At that convention in 1949, he also took a strong stand on racism. Now, mind you, this is 1949. We are 15 years before the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King Jr., and we're in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Okay, so Dr. E.W. Perry, who at that time was the president of the African American National Baptist Convention, was invited by Dr. Lee to come and preach at the Southern Baptist Convention's annual meeting in OKC. Now, Dr. Perry was a pastor there in Oklahoma City at the Tabernacle Baptist Church, but this was the first time that a black man had ever preached at the Southern Baptist annual meeting. He actually asked Dr. Lee, in exchange for agreeing to come, that he have no time limit, and Dr. Lee agreed to that. He gave him no time limit. And at the end of his sermon, Dr. Lee came up and joined him on stage, and he said this, quote, "Dr. Perry, I want you to come here and stand by me and take my hand. I want this convention to witness a parable in black and white, written in red. You said that 60 years ago you were born in a log cabin in Mississippi. I too was born in a log cabin in South Carolina. The same Christ who saved you is the Christ who saved me, and both of us have been washed clean in the precious blood of the Lamb. This is the parable in black and white, written in red." After his 3 elections as president, Dr. Lee continued pastoring at Bellevue Baptist Church for another decade there. It's estimated that on average, Dr. Lee made 10 visits in homes every day of his ministry in Memphis. And even after he resigned in 1960 on the 10th of April, he continued to travel and preach all over the country and all over the world. He's said to have preached in 42 different states and 7 different countries after his retirement. On average, he traveled 100,000 miles every year, preaching in large and small churches all over the world. When he did resign as pastor there at Bellevue, or retire rather, the papers wrote of him saying, "For half a century he has thrown punches at the devil, punches containing the same power and vengeance of those of Billy Sunday, George Truett, or C.H. Spurgeon. In all of these years he has never quit slugging. He says the devil never sleeps, and so he has worked night and day to bring the gospel to as many people as possible." And for the next 18 years following 1960, he traveled the world preaching to sometimes thousands of individuals. He's best remembered for his sermon, Payday Someday, which he first preached in 1919 as a devotional. And you remember that deacon asked him to turn it into a full-length sermon. He turned it into a sermon, and boy did he preach it. He is said to have preached that sermon over 1,200 times. Some estimates say 1,275 times he preached Payday Someday. That would equate to almost 5 straight years of preaching that sermon every day. That's how long it would take him to preach that sermon if he did it every day. He preached it 1,200 times over the course of his ministry. Even in 1962, after his retirement, he was still preaching major events like the Texas Baptist Evangelism Conference. In that conference, it said that at the conclusion, there was hardly a dry eye as more than 100 persons with tears streaming down their cheeks walked down the aisles to ask God to bring revivals to their lives and to their churches. Over the course of his ministry, Dr. Lee prepared over 50 books of sermons. He delivered Payday Someday over 1,200 times. And that sermon, indeed, Payday Someday, was filmed and made into an opera. Given his many decades of pastoral ministry and preaching and evangelism and itinerant ministry on some cases, it's not a surprise that he would have many great quotes that we ought to know. I want to give a few of those for a parting gift here before we conclude. Dr. Lee was quoted as saying, "Even though the mill of God grinds slowly, it grinds to powder. And the only way I know for any man or woman on earth to escape the sinner's payday on earth and the sinner's hell beyond, making sure of the Christian's payday, is through Christ Jesus, who took the sinner's place upon the cross, becoming for all sinners all that God must judge, so that sinners through faith in Christ Jesus might become all that God cannot judge." That's beautiful. I mentioned earlier that he used repetition incessantly, but when he does, it's not mentally taxing. For example, this is from his sermon, The Constant Call of Christ's Cross. You can see the alliteration already. This quote begins, Education is a roofless house for protection. Good behavior is a wall which falls when you lean on it. Rituals and observances of days are a leaking boat for a long and dangerous voyage. Dependence on good works to save from sins is a silk thread, not a chain to anchor the ship in times of storm. Human goodness and kindness is a house built upon shifting sands. Only in Christ's cross can we find safety. Elsewhere, he's noted as saying, "We live in a world of invertebrate theology, jellyfish morality, seesaw religion, India rubber convictions, excuse me, I get tickled reading this. Somersault philosophy and a psychology that tells us what we already know in words which we cannot understand." Now, bear in mind that even though he was this magnanimous figure universally respected and revered, he didn't always love his own sermons. At one point when he was pastoring the First Baptist Church of New Orleans, he regarded one of his sermons as a complete flop. And a deacon took him out after service to try to encourage him, and it's said that they rode about 3 miles in silence before Dr. Lee broke the silence and said, "What was wrong with me this morning?" And the deacon responded and said, "Dr. Lee, you laid a skyscraper foundation, and then you built a chicken coop on top of it." Dr. Lee responded and said, "If there had been a capsule on that platform, I would have crawled into it and mailed myself to the dead letter office with a 1-cent stamp." Later in his life, Adrian Rogers, one of his successors at Bellevue Baptist Church, asked Dr. Lee, "Dr. Lee, before you go to heaven, couldn't we take your brain and put it into my head?" And Dr. Lee responded, "My boy, that would be like putting a grand piano into a hall closet." Upon his death, Dr. Lee died quietly in Memphis on the 20th of July, 1978. Shortly before he died, he was visited by Adrian Rogers, Cliff Barrows, Tommy Lane, and Billy Graham, who was a good friend of his, and had been for a long time. Dr. Lee was bedridden at the time and mostly in and out of consciousness in the living room of his home. The men gathered around the bed and began to sing his favorite hymn, "Majestic Sweetness Sits Enthroned." Then they sang, "Come Thou Angel Band." And at one point, while singing this last song, Dr. Lee opened his eyes and put his hands on Billy Graham's face, pulling him down to kiss his forehead. He looked Dr. Graham in the eyes and said, "Have you won the world yet?" Not long after, Dr. Lee was gone. Since then, we have come to recognize the value and greatness of R.G. Lee. It was not a revelation that had to wait until after he was gone. During his lifetime, 2 biographies were written about him. The first was entitled Robert G. Lee, A Chosen Vessel, written by E. Schuyler English in 1949. The second was entitled Robert Greene Lee, The Authorized Biography, written by John Irvin Huss in 1967. Since then, no biographies have been written of him. He's buried in Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Baptist Directory. Again, I'm Dr. Michael Schultz, and I hope that I'll see you again soon. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye.